Okay, I think we should go ahead and get started. I'm sure more people will continue joining. It's only 10:02 here on the East Coast. My name is Paige Arthur. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center on International Cooperation at NYU. Very grateful for your presence today to talk about building peace in the age of emerging cybersecurity risks. We have really a wonderful group of people here coming from different perspectives. It was 3 years ago this month that we held our first Data for Peace workshop here in New York. And it's really incredible to see how this community of practice has grown, including civil society, private sector, government, researchers from all over the world. So thanks to all of you for being part of it. Please do introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us where you're coming from and maybe a sentence about what this subject means to you and how it affects your work. I have to say that we didn't really imagine when we planned this event last month that we would be dealing with a fundamental crisis of the post-World War II multilateral order, as well as cyber attacks on a massive scale as part of a massive military offensive in Ukraine. And I know that all of you on this call have an interest in cybersecurity, so I have no doubt that you've been reading about the attacks in Ukraine and about the coordinated attempts to disrupt those attacks from government, from private sector, such as Microsoft on this call today, the EU and many others. So we had initially envisioned a discussion about how cybersecurity issues are affecting peace building and prevention work, particularly through threats to vulnerable groups and organizations working with vulnerable groups. I won't be surprised if today we end up discussing the wider issues that are very live right now. So I really thank the speakers for joining. I don't want to delay any further. So I'm handing over to Branka Panic, a non-resident fellow here at CIC.
Thank you, Paige. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Data for Peace Dialogues. As Data for Peace community of practice, we have been looking into potentials of emerging technologies and data-driven approaches to sustain peace and prevent conflict. And this work obviously comes with new vulnerabilities for different actors across the world. And when we talk about cybersecurity in specific, what we saw over the last couple of years is increased number of malicious incidents. And mostly we heard about these attacks on financial institutions, healthcare facilities, energy grids, but lately even attacks on humanitarian organizations and non-government organizations and even United Nations and UN missions, they all face an increased number of cyber attacks. And with this, we are dedicating this session to building peace in the age of emerging cybersecurity risks. And as Paige said, it's hard to talk about peace and cybersecurity at this specific moment without looking at Ukraine and Russia and how cyber attacks have been used not only in the previous couple of days or weeks or months, but even for years. And we are on a daily basis reading news about Ukrainian websites taken offline or malware attacks on government systems or even individual hackers, not only states, but individual hackers now providing help to Ukraine. However, when we announced this session, the motivation for our discussion, this was a couple of weeks ago, the motivation for our discussion was another sophisticated cybersecurity attack launched against computer servers hosting information held by the ICRC. And this attack compromised the personal data and confidential information of vulnerable people, including those separated by their families due to conflict or migration, natural disasters, missing persons, and their families, people in detention. And only a couple of days ago, another cyber attack was reported by the Doctors Without Borders, luckily this time not impacting its medical humanitarian operations. So all of these cybersecurity attacks are a reminder that any data for peace building and prevention work comes with cybersecurity risks as well. And as we are integrating AI and AI-related technologies to peace building and prevention work, cybersecurity risks will most likely increase and potentially even undermine the entire trust in peace operations, in peace work, and peace programming. So with this, we are thrilled to welcome our speakers today who will discuss not only current, but maybe some of the future potential cybersecurity risks in the humanitarian and peace building space, and share potential avenues towards building resiliency against cyber attacks and cyber crimes. We will also explore what solutions can and should be adopted, how not only governments, but private sector and civil society can come together to commit to agreements that they have made so far, and how we can collectively sustain peace in cyberspace. So with this, I would like to welcome our guest speakers, Ziad Achkar, who is a research affiliated Better Evidence Project at George Mason University, Eleanor Powells, who is a senior fellow at the Global Center on Cooperative Security, John Herring, who is a senior government affairs manager for the digital diplomacy team at Microsoft. And we are still waiting and hoping Adrian Ogi will join us, who is the Chief Operations Officer at the Cyberpiece Institute, who has a little bit of struggle to join Zoom, but hopefully will join us in time for his part of the contribution. Our guests will have 5 to 7 minutes each to introduce their work, their views on this topic, and we will have some time for questions and answers. As Paige invited our audience, first of all, welcome to our audience as well. Please feel free to continue to introduce yourself in the chat, to tell us how your work is related, what you are interested in, why you are interested in this topic, and also feel free to keep putting questions throughout the introductions. I will be collecting those questions, and then we will cover those in the Q&A section. So with this, I will give floor to Ziad. Ziad, it's good to have you back on Data for Peace Dialogues. Ziad was following intensively what is happening and what was happening with ICRC cybersecurity attack and implications. Can you help our audience here to understand what happened, what ICRC reaction was, where we are now, what can we expect in the future?
Yeah, good morning, Branka. Good morning, Paige. Good morning to everyone joining us today for this very important discussion. And I think it's particularly timely considering the events happening around the world. I think to get started, it's good to set the stage for where we are as a field and where we've come from for the last 10 to 15 years to then get into the cybersecurity issues, particularly the ICRC hack and what's happening right now in Ukraine. And I think it's important just to think about the evolution, both in terms of the practice, but also kind of our thinking about these issues. So if I look back, for the last 10, 15 years as a humanitarian sector and a peace building sector, there was a lot of enthusiasm about the power and the ability of technology to revolutionize the way we do business, to provide services. There was a mad rush towards kind of digitalizing services. So everything from needs assessment, registration, logistics, you name it. Every part of a humanitarian operation and peace building was pushed to be digital. And I'll note that a lot of this push was coming from donors, from governments, from agencies who really bought into this potential of digital tools. And at the same time, we saw a lot of excitement about this, about the impact of things like crisis mapping, for remote sensing, satellite imagery application, a lot of open source and reliance on social media, which we see a lot of it happening right now in Ukraine. We see a lot of videos, a lot of maps being developed, we see a lot of information being shared, and a lot of social media and communication tools being applied as part of the conflict, and whether it's from a communication standpoint or from a military standpoint. And so we really started with this kind of really rush and excitement about potential of tools, and really dived into, you know, what some people would call kind of this techno utopia, if you may. But at the time, you know, if you look back 10 years ago, we weren't really talking about cybersecurity. The main conversation wasn't really centered about data responsibility or digital rights. And to be honest, in the early 2010s, there were very few kind of guidelines or discussions happening about that data responsibility. There was no real handbooks about data responsibility or cybersecurity issues. But those conversations were kind of starting to happen. They were happening in a little bit of small circles. There were definitely concerns about digitalization and what that's going to do and the potential to open up for harms and risks that could be exploited because of cybersecurity concerns. I think one of the first real kind of documents that came out from UN-OCHA in 2014 was by Daniel Gilman, who looked at kind of, you know, what does cyber warfare and cybersecurity mean for humanitarian actors and this kind of humanitarian cyberspace. And so if somebody's interested, they can look back at it. I think it was published in like October 2014. But if you fast forward to today, I think you see a really major shift into how we think about these issues. There's, for one, a lot more guidance, a lot more tools for humanitarians to operate in digital space. We have handbooks from the ICRC, from UN-OCHA. There's a signal code for kind of that helps organizations think about, you know, what kind of tools they're using, what kind of data they're using, how to think about cybersecurity. The Sphere standards have been updated to include data and digital and cyber as part of their component, part of planning. So we see a lot of evolutions. And I think also critically, from an individual and organization side, we see a lot of more questioning and assumptions about what technology can do and what it does and what the digital tools provide. And I think we are at a better stage now to kind of really dive in to talk about some of these cybersecurity concerns. And I think we see it now in the events of last week really build on cases and experiences we've seen around the world in the past few years to different degrees. I'll note that the ICRC hack is definitely not the first hack that's happened to humanitarian and peace building organizations, and it will probably not be the last one. I'd be shocked if it is the last one. And I'd say that while very few public organizations have been public about their cybersecurity vulnerabilities, we know that, you know, organizations like the UN have been hacked, and they were quiet about it for many months. We know that NGOs were hacked, and employee data and individual donor data were hacked. The ICRC hack was pretty much focused, Branka pointed out, on vulnerable population and their information. And so this was a very advanced type of hack that targeted vulnerable populations very specifically. But I'll note that there's also a lot more concerns and a lot of issues related to cybersecurity when it comes to also issues related to biometric data. And, you know, humanitarian organizations and peace building organizations are increasingly collecting high-level detailed information about the people they're working with, where they're working, and the people they're serving. And that kind of information is highly relevant for different actors, and especially in a conflict setting, especially in a place like Ukraine, where often this kind of information can be a very valuable source of actionable intelligence. And we've seen this happen around the world, you know, with Afghanistan and Yemen and Jordan, just to name a few. And if anybody was following that yesterday, Google shut off their live map feature in Ukraine because it was showing movement of individuals where people were gathering, was showing traffic patterns that put people in vulnerable positions to be potentially targeted. And so to kind of bring us back to focus on the cybersecurity, I think there's three big dimensions that are at play here. I think I call them the technical, organizational, and political. On the first one, a technical and capacity question, there's a big question on the capacity of organizations to maintain high-level standards of care and cybersecurity. For example, the ICRC is one of the best resourced funded organizations, yet they were hacked. They had a vulnerability in their system that went unpatched for about 4 months. You know, the FBI and CISA had put out a warning in September that there was a vulnerability in that kind of system. ICRC got hacked in November. They didn't identify the hack till January. And so the hackers were in their systems for 70 days. So on that note, there's a technical capacity issue that's at play. The second, and I think this is where it's very interesting, is the organizational dimension. The ICRC hack and the subsequent event have shown us that organizations need to be open and they need to be transparent about when hacks are happening. ICRC has done a fantastic job being open and communicative with the world about what was happening. A lot of times organizations don't bring that up. We don't learn about these issues. There's very much a lack of coordination. And frankly, that's a big problem. And it also raises questions about accountability to vulnerable populations, which we can dive into. Realize I have 1 minute left. So my last point is there's a political dimension at this play that oftentimes humanitarians and peace building actors are very reluctant to getting involved and engaged in. Attacks against humanitarian organizations, against peace building organizations, and at different points in time are violations of international humanitarian law. You're targeting data of humanitarian organizations. They're neutral actors. There's different conventions that protect their rights. But the ICRC hack has also raised more concerns for this kind of push towards kind of a digital Geneva Convention to reemphasize those rights in the IHL in a digital cyberspace. And I think this conversation about cybersecurity really falls into kind of also these discussions. So I'll end it here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and Q&A.
Thank you, Ziad, for this great intro. You gave us so many interesting potential avenues for this discussion. I will just point quickly to one is how quickly the situation changed for humanitarian and peace building organizations from something where cyber wars or cyber attacks were something external to them, and now suddenly they are becoming actually attacked themselves. And then the other one is this shift, and I would like us to come back to this later in the discussion. The pathway that we went through since UN attacks a couple of years ago, and then what we learned throughout the way, how many things we actually managed to implement, and what are different actions that we took with ICRC attack. So let's remember this for the discussion, but without any further ado, I think I will give the floor to Eleanor now. Eleanor, your work is really fascinating and so much in line with the data for peace community of practice. And I will definitely recommend to our audiences to look at all of the things that you are publishing and working on. But for this specific webinar, I would like us to concentrate on your specific work on cybersecurity. Last year, you published a paper, Peacekeeping in an Era of Converging Technological and Security Threats, where you are developing 2 case studies on peacekeeping in an era of AI and cyber threats. So can you lead our audiences a bit through these cases and through your work in cybersecurity? You are on mute, Eleanor.
Thank you so much. Dear Paige, dear Branka, dear colleagues, let me thank you for the chance to speak with you today about existing and future cybersecurity risks emerging in the peacekeeping and peace building space. So several of my research projects focus on analyzing technical trends across sectors from AI to cyber and biosecurity, and forecasting how converging technologies are used by conflict parties. So the evolving cyber threats landscape and the convergence of AI and cyber techniques has strategic and operational implications for peacekeeping. And in this research paper for UNDPO that you mentioned, Branka, indeed, I built 2 case studies to shed light on emerging vulnerabilities that could compromise the transition towards data-driven peacekeeping. So the first case study is about preserving data confidentiality and focuses on the potential collective data harms that could come from processing online large amounts of behavioral and context information about populations in a crisis region. The second case study shows the need for peacekeeping operations to mitigate potential threats to the integrity of its own data sets and data-driven analytics. So the first case study, securing sensitive population data sets. The field of peacekeeping increasingly monitors what we could call patterns of life about civilian populations living in countries prone to violent outbreaks. So beyond social media and open source intelligence, peacekeeping actors are now able to collect behavioral and situational information on populations using automated data capture technologies. And access to the large data sets captured through satellites and drones can then be translated into dashboards and digital maps produced for improving situational awareness, for locating outbreaks of violence, monitoring the position and movements of troops, and detecting civilian infrastructure in need of protection. So for instance, such maps can visualize the probability of meeting checkpoints controlled by child soldiers in specific areas. They can reveal the location, settlements, and movements of ethnic subgroups, minorities, and refugees. And in the near future, the vast amount of digital information and routine behaviors produced by populations could be analyzed by AI computing, with the potential to modernize the field of peacekeeping. But protecting such sensitive data sets from manipulation and cyber exfiltration will be a complex challenge, requiring specific skills in information security. So troves of information about individuals' locations, livelihoods, behaviors, and opinions can become subject to surveillance and targeting practices by malicious actors. Population subgroups could be targeted for the information they share online. Digital profiles can compromise the safety of local informants. A cyber attack could be used to exfiltrate personal information about vulnerable groups, including youth, for recruitment, abduction, or with the goal to sell or leak those sensitive data sets to conflict parties or actors conducting state surveillance. And behavioral surveillance through algorithmic and cyber techniques has become a reality of intrastate conflict. A cyber attack could also be used to access situational information for offensive strikes. In 2019, 6 different attacks targeted deconflicted civilian locations and humanitarian movements in northwest Syria. Other recent events have shown how targets in modern conflicts increasingly include biometrics of civilian populations, and Ziad mentioned it a few minutes ago. So in 2019, during the conflict in Yemen, Houthi rebel groups have been vying for access to personal data of civilians that benefited from food distribution. In 2021, the Taliban captured US military biometric devices that contain sensitive personal data and could be used to identify Afghans who had supported coalition forces. So in a complex cyber and tech assemblage, it will become critical to preserve data confidentiality and enable the adoption of new technologies in ways that respect the rights, dignity, and agency of affected populations and ensure trust in peacekeeping operations. Now, the second case study is about preserving data integrity and focuses on the potential for adversarial data manipulation attack to corrupt, to disrupt the intelligence lifecycle in peacekeeping. So developments at the convergence of AI, deep learning, and cybersecurity show that AI malware can learn to manipulate the integrity of data sets. And I give you concrete examples in 2 different data analytic domains. So first, experts in the field of genomics have demonstrated how a malware injection can infiltrate genetic analysis software and alter fragments of DNA sequences within individuals' genomes. Second, the same deep learning techniques that are used to discern signals and objects in satellite pictures, like roads, bridges, or buildings, can also be misused to purposely construct, simulate, or modify those signals in satellite imagery and open source maps. And so by data poisoning, an AI malware can therefore compromise the functioning, performance, and predictive value of other algorithmic systems. And there are red teaming evidence of such manipulations across data-driven domains, from image processing of cancer biopsies to real-time analysis of sensors in transportation systems. And so as the combination of AI and big data capture, including satellites and GIS, become parts of situational awareness, adversarial attacks could compromise data-driven analysis in peacekeeping, and manipulation of existing data sets like SAGE, even combined with the injection of synthetic data, could compromise signals monitoring and reporting. So for instance, within SAGE, a malware could be trained to manipulate the content of reported incidents, modifying words that label types of events, locations, numbers of armed groups, or threat identification codes. A malware could also learn to inject false data, noise, into recorded events. The resulting harm would be to affect the success of peacekeeping operations, or the neutrality, impartiality, and independence of the mandate. SAGE is one example, but other data processes might be more vulnerable. So potential threats are also amplified by the operational complexity of managing fragmented data collection and curation efforts in peacekeeping. And as underlined by a 2020 IPI report, in addition to official databases such as I2, SAGE, or Cosmos, almost every unit has its own unofficial databases, and this multiplication of data sets results from a lack of trust in the larger platforms. So in general, the deployment of AI-led data manipulation will drastically alter the relationship to evidence and truth across many peacekeeping activities, including conflict investigations, ceasefire supervision, and supporting verification mechanisms. The capacity of a range of actors to influence conflict analysis, peacekeepers' perceptions, and public opinion with misleading information could have powerful long-term implications for the role of the UN in maintaining peace and security. So in the near future, modeling and simulating the ways in which peacekeeping data are stored, accessed, and retrieved for analysis could be a useful method for forecasting potential threats, detecting systemic vulnerabilities, and building mitigation plans to address them. Increasingly diverse sectors facing information security risk, for instance, in genomics and biomedicine, rely on those forms of sandboxing and operational foresight. So in the interest of time, I will stop here, but I'm happy to discuss those methods more during the conversation, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Eleanor, for guiding us through these two case studies and also helping us to understand that cybersecurity has couple of dimensions as well. So it's not only about stealing the data, but also manipulating the data that is out there, which can be a completely new threat that we as a field have to deal with, especially as we are looking into potentials of using this vast amount of data that is out there. So what happens if malicious actors start manipulating these contents and changing this cyberspace in a certain way? Thanks so much, Eleanor, for this. Some of the comments and questions that we already got are actually great introduction for our next speaker, Adrian. I will bring you into the discussion. Welcome to the panel. Adrian is a Chief Operations Officer at the Cyberpiece Institute and worked previously in the French Cybersecurity Agency, European Cybersecurity Agency, World Economic Forum Center for Cybersecurity in Geneva. So there is a vast experience, Adrian, that you are bringing to this panel on cybersecurity. I think most interesting for this discussion is actually the perspective of your own institution, of the Cyberpiece Institute. Your organization is showing that these cyber attacks, as the one that we heard about on ICRC, are not rare, right? You are bringing this contribution to the field, filling this gap of actually showing how often these attacks are happening. And what your institution is doing is also looking at the risks to NGOs and how they can prepare and defend against the growing proliferation of cyber attacks. So can you introduce this work a little bit more and help us understand what Cyberpiece Institute is actually working on?
Sure. Well, thanks a lot for the opportunity, and apologies for coming in late, had some issues connecting. Indeed, so the Institute was set up in 2019 against the proliferation of attacks, increasing sophistication and number of attacks in particular against vulnerable communities, which we've seen, unfortunately, increasing even further since then during the pandemic, attacks against hospitals, for instance, and more recently attacks against NGOs and against humanitarian actors, as was pointed out by Ziad and Eleanor. And so the Institute was created together by civil society and private companies, namely Microsoft, MasterCard, and the Hewlett Foundation, identifying the need for an independent entity that could try to document a little bit more what was happening and drive more accountability. I think Ziad touched upon the notion of accountability at the end of his speech. explaining that we should try to start talking about accountability, including in the NGO sector, the humanitarian sector. Obviously, we do need to talk about accountability there, but we also want to talk about accountability in all the other sectors at government level, at private sector level, even at individual level, right? Our idea, if you want, is that everyone that steps online has a role to play, has a set of responsibilities, and the Institute was set up to basically understand what those responsibilities are and if people are acting against these responsibilities or not. And so the Institute, in particular around the humanitarian sector, puts in motion that idea of accountability through a three-step theory of change that is actually mapped in our organizational structure. So we, first of all, try to really understand what is happening on the ground. So we want to provide assistance to vulnerable communities to be able to document the harms done to people through cyber attacks, which we think is a way to effect change, simply to shed light on what can happen to human life. And Eleanor, through her studies, pointed out to some very, if I dare say, dark scenarios of how manipulation and cyber attacks could even impact the human genome. And there are unfortunately indeed ways in which human life is impacted already today through cyber attacks, which we've documented in healthcare, which we're documenting now in the humanitarian field, and even doing some very recent work now with what's happening in Ukraine. But our first mission, if you want, is to provide help to vulnerable communities to understand what is happening to them, so that we're able to talk about this with proper data, with prime evidence, to drive change at systemic level through the United Nations, through other international fora that I'm sure John can speak about later. And so the first pillar of the Institute is really the idea of assistance. And I'll tell you a little bit more about our Cyberpiece Builders program in a second. But just for you to understand the loop of the Institute, once we've provided that help and understood what was happening or what is happening on the ground, we then try to really investigate the root causes and understand what are the rational, basically, what are the reasons for that to happen. If there are bad actors behind, who are they? Why are they doing this? What are the markets that are making that happen, right? If you look at for instance, some of the offensive weapons that are today being sold to conduct cyber attacks, why is there a market for that? And then using that evidence and that strong data, we then do our advocacy work towards decision makers in the public sector, in the private sector, in a multi-stakeholder approach. And again, I think John will talk a little bit about that, so I'm not going to dive in too much on this. But it's really an interesting scenario. And you mentioned that I indeed spent my career in cybersecurity in various roles at government, private, and even international organizations level. And the Institute has this fascinating model to really affect change through a very quick loop. So it's I think quite a fascinating organization, if I dare say. And I invite all of you to look at our website, and different outputs that we have out there are really documenting the harms done to people in cyberspace, and hoping to effect change soon. So the Cyberpiece Builders, to deep dive just for a second on the humanitarian threat, is a corporate volunteering cybersecurity program. So what we do is we partner with private companies, only private companies for now, and obviously we check with which companies we work with, so we make sure they're not on sanctions lists and things like that. And then once we have an agreement with them, then we bring in volunteers from these companies that have experience in cybersecurity to help humanitarian organizations for a couple of hours a year. So it's in fact the only skills-based corporate volunteering opportunity available today for cybersecurity professionals. There are other volunteering opportunities that people can take, off outside business hours, in the evening, in the weekend, things like that. But when it comes to doing that through a corporation with a trustworthy network, which for us was paramount when we created the Cyberpiece Builders, it's really the only network out there. And the network helps NGOs, so organizations, in particular active in the humanitarian response, increase their cyber defenses. So it's a lot of 1 hour, 2 hours conversations, presentations to staff to train them on cybersecurity, to explain to them the importance of 2FA, to let them know what are particular threats that they may be facing, to let them know that we've seen a couple of passwords that have leaked in the dark web that they should really update very soon, and explain to them why it is important that they do so. There's some security assessments to evaluate the general maturity level and things like that. So NGOs basically come to us. We also have a partnership agreement signing process to make sure we work with NGOs that are legit, that are okay to that fit basically the scope of our mission. And then we figure out what are their needs, and we list that in a job board. Simple as that. And then volunteers can come look at the job board and be like, all right, I have some free time next week. Maybe I can help do that. Because of the construct of that network using volunteers, there's certain things that we do, certain things we don't do. So we do a lot of pre-incident and post-incident work. So a lot of basically security hardening and training and education. But we don't go into incident response, right? So if an organization is being ransomed right now, a volunteer-driven response would not be adequate. So that's where a response from other partners, whether public or private, may come in. There are particular reasons why the network was also designed like this, working with the private sector, is because we leverage the trust that institutions have in certain companies and the trust that these companies have in their employees, which allows us to protect the trust that we put in the network and to make sure that the people we bring to NGOs are people that are going to do more good than harm, which is sometimes difficult when we work with individual people, whose associations may not be necessarily known. So there's a level of risk that's inherent when you're providing cybersecurity assistance, but we really do everything is possible to mitigate that. The Builders was launched a couple of months ago. There's about 30 NGOs right now that are getting help. We've got about, I think it's close to 20 companies that have signed up. We've got over 50 volunteers that are helping right now. And obviously what is happening in Ukraine is a big source of worry to everyone. They're obviously in Ukraine, in the region as well, in their neighboring countries. In fact, dare say even in Russia, there's some hackback activities that may pop up, and there may actually be people putting oil on fire and without necessarily willing to do so, potentially escalating a situation that's already fairly volatile. So we're very mindful of what we do in the region, and at the moment it's mainly offering support to help organizations elevate their cybersecurity defenses, just in preparation of the humanitarian crisis that is already unfolding, and that may lead to cyber attacks against these NGOs, like the attack against RTRC. I think I'm going to stop there because probably went already a little bit of time, and leave some time for questions as well, and for John and Paige. Thanks.
Thank you, Adrian. This was perfect, and thanks so much for showing us actually how important the role of the non-government organizations can be, especially in scaling some solutions, how important the volunteer contributions are as well. We saw many other examples in the previous decade with open street map or mappings to Shahidi, like how these initiatives can be scaled with the help of volunteers. So hopefully this will be a part of a solution for the cybersecurity threats as well. This is a perfect introduction now for our next speaker, for John, who is actually advocating for a multi-stakeholder foundation for the peace in cyberspace. We can't have this multi-stakeholder foundation without the private sector as well, right? Without the tech companies. John, as I said, is a senior government affairs manager for the digital diplomacy team at Microsoft. John, whenever I read something about cybersecurity, I always read Microsoft as part of the, like, people go to Microsoft, right? To try to find a solution, to see what is happening, to try to find some avenues of answers. Can you tell us what is actually Microsoft working in this space of peace and cybersecurity?
Yeah, thanks, Branka, and such a privilege to be on this panel and to be speaking to such an international audience today. Yeah, Microsoft has, I think, fairly deliberately for many years now been trying to be quite forward-leaning on these issues. It's been so good to hear about the risks from Eleanor, from Ziad, and from Adrian, and specific examples of vulnerable organizations in particular that have been compromised by sophisticated attacks. One thing we also need to talk about, I think, is the other side of that equation in terms of who's responsible, and why is this happening? Because to Ziad's, I thought you had a wonderful sort of schema earlier in terms of the technical, the organizational, and the political elements of this, in terms of where responsibilities lie and how change can be made and how we can improve security. There's a lot organizations can do to improve security. It doesn't matter if you are a under-financed NGO that's just getting started somewhere, or if you're a very sophisticated Fortune 500 company. Things like zero trust architectures, multi-factor authentication, adopting enterprise cloud security options. These are things that will dramatically improve your organization's security. Improve transparency will help us as a global, international system be more aware of threats and respond to them. But at the end of the day, there is always going to be room for the most sophisticated actors to be innovating ways around that. And that's why Microsoft's been in particular very concerned about escalating cyber conflict that is driven by nation states. They are the most advanced, most well-resourced actors that have virtually, often limitless funds to contribute to this space. There's been no shortage of stories about nation state cyber attacks, whether they're done independently by nation states or through proxies. And they're in particular troubling because they raise the stakes for the entire ecosystem. I think one way to think about the threat environment is, today's 0 day becomes tomorrow's tool of the script kiddie or whatever lower level hacker. Capabilities in this domain of conflict proliferate across an ecosystem of threat actors very quickly. And so when you're allowing, one end of the spectrum, the most advanced end, to run roughshod without clear expectations for responsible behavior, you're actually upping the threat level across the ecosystem itself. And so that was, I think, a big prompt for our team at Microsoft to exist to begin with. We've been around since 2018. We're at Microsoft's digital diplomacy team. And I think it's based on a recognition that there needs to be more voices and conversations about peace and security online, and that there's too incremental progress at this point in terms of setting expectations for responsible state behavior in particular, in what really should be viewed as a new domain of conflict. But unlike other domains, it has lots of overlapping responsibilities. Some of those have been outlined already by previous speakers, but in particular, when it comes to the technology industry, we design, develop, maintain, often serve as first responders and a front line of defense for this whole domain. And so certainly need to be part of conversations on how to secure it. And those conversations take place in different spaces. I'll run through just a brief history of cybersecurity dialogues at the UN for the sake of the audience we have here, because I think it's important to pull more folks into these conversations and just have an awareness of, well, where are we talking about responsible state behavior online? Primarily, those conversations have taken place at the UN within a group of governmental experts. That's been a successive round of these GGEs dating back to about 2004. The high watermark of these dialogues was in 2015, when this coalition of 25 states, or perhaps it was 20 at the time, was able to recognize 11 norms for responsible state behavior that were exclusive to cyberspace, as well as to reinforce that, hey, international law does apply to state behavior online. And that served as I think, an important flag in the ground. Hey, this is what we can all sort of get behind and agree on. However, progress since 2015 has been incremental on the diplomatic side, and in fact, I think quite concerning on the cyber conflict side. 2017 was a particular low point in that it was both the year that the next round of that GGE had their talks collapse and be unable to reach a consensus, and at the same time just saw so many high-profile attacks that year. Folks probably remember at least one of the WannaCry or NotPetya attacks from that summer, or if you were in the United States, the Equifax hack from later that year, all against seemingly no progress on a diplomatic space. And so what's been interesting since 2017, really beginning in 2018, is to see a multi-stakeholder community start to rise and say, hey, we need to be part of these conversations. I spoke a little bit about Microsoft establishing a digital diplomacy team that is focused on these issues. It was also the year that the industry writ large from the technology side came together to form a cybersecurity tech accord to have an exclusive voice for the technology industry on peace and security matters. The Charter of Trust, launched by Siemens that same year, had a similar foundation. And then the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace became a very novel and groundbreaking multi-stakeholder commitment to peace and security principles online that includes now over 80 governments exactly, and over 1,200 multi-stakeholder supporters from around the world committed to shared principles. And then, of course, just the following year in 2019, the Cyberpiece Institute was founded, which has a unique voice from an NGO perspective on these peace and security challenges. And so with that foundation, we started to see greater inclusion of multi-stakeholder perspectives in UN dialogues. Last year was an encouraging year from a diplomatic perspective, in that both the newest GGE dialogue as well as a parallel UN dialogue called the Open-Ended Working Group were both able to reach consensus reports, some of which did reference explicitly the value of multi-stakeholder participation, the need to protect vulnerable sectors like healthcare, like energy and other elements of critical infrastructure, which was encouraging. And of course, at the same time, 2021 had its own slew of high-profile attacks that we're all very well and familiar with at this point. You know, the year was kicked off with cascading revelations around SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline, companies I hadn't heard of before, but which are now household names. The Exchange server hack, the list goes on. I think the reference has been made earlier to also the rise of cyber mercenaries, this new market of private sector offensive actors that are sometimes legal and selling very sophisticated capabilities to often authoritarian governments that use surveillance technology to target dissidents or to silence free speech. These are concerning trends which need answers and which I think do reflect some important open questions from a diplomatic standpoint. And I'll just highlight two to close here. SolarWinds is a good example of a very advanced, very persistent hack that took place for, as we can tell, many, many months, if not years, required an incredible number of security researchers on the offensive side to be conducting that hack. And then at the end of the day, seems to have been focused on espionage. From everything we can tell, it was focused on spying on certain specific government targets. In doing that, the actors conducted a supply chain attack which compromised thousands of systems all around the world. So if the international community has tacitly accepted espionage as sort of being, well, that's just how government affairs take place around the world sometimes in the past, does that meaningfully change when in the process of conducting that espionage, you're putting so many thousands more at risk? We certainly feel it does. Another example would be the Colonial Pipeline hack. This is an attack that damaged and undermined critical infrastructure, put many at risk very rapidly. Critical infrastructure based on these UN norms is supposed to be beyond the pale of acceptable behavior by states. In this case, the attack was conducted by a criminal organization, not a state actor. However, does a state have a responsibility to take action against a criminal actor operating within its borders? What does due diligence mean in this case under an international law? So that's just two examples of some of the open questions that it would be very important to address through international dialogues at the UN and elsewhere to start seeing more responsible behavior in this space. Because again, there is a lot that everyone needs to be doing to improve their own security. You would solve the vast majority of cyber incidents if people employed just multi-factor authentication and zero trust architecture. But at the end of the day, even with all of those things in place, we also need to be talking about how do we curb the behaviors of the most advanced threat actors as well.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks for some of this straight to the point recommendations as well. We did get a question which was immediately about that. What are some general recommendations for cybersecurity enhancement for humanitarian organizations? We often think about complicated, and quite often they are complicated solutions, but there are some simple steps as well that we can all take. And at the very beginning, start thinking about what cybersecurity threats can be and where are all of our vulnerabilities. And thinking about this, I will actually go back maybe to Ziad. And Ziad, you mentioned a couple of these documents that were adopted on different policies on do no harm. We call it do no harm. We already had one webinar that covered do no harm and conflict sensitivity. Can you help us understand, is cybersecurity part of these conversations? Is cybersecurity part of do no harm approach, or there is something that these organizations have to, something more that these organizations have to think about, some additional, and I think John already gave us some points out there, but from your experiences yet and from following ICRC, I'm sure for many in this space, this was really shocking to see that the organization that is investing so much and working so much on do no harm and putting so much resources in this was again so vulnerable. Or maybe not so vulnerable, maybe the attacks became so much more sophisticated because we know that these technologies are developing exponentially. It's hard to keep up. But can you help us understand how complicated this entire concept is of do no harm in cybersecurity?
Yeah, it is complicated. I think John touched upon a lot of it. Is that, you know, we're operating in a similar space. You know, militaries, intelligence agencies are all operating kind of in the same cyberspace, and repercussions are oftentimes not limited to a military installation and to a, you know, an embassy and so that is a reality of the cyber universe or cyberspace that's a little bit different than a traditional form of espionage or traditional form of more of the physical realm. I think on one end, to go back to the ICRC hack and what lessons we can learn and how that's complicated. I think oftentimes I think there's simple solutions. I think sometimes it's also a question of from a data standpoint, if we focus on data collection, you know, do we need to be collecting all this kind of data, especially on vulnerable populations? You know, at some point, we also have to question, you know, the increasing reliance on sophisticated technology and sophisticated tools that, you know, to John and Adrian and Eleanor's point earlier, is that sometimes humanitarian organizations just don't have necessarily the capacity to keep up with the changing technology, the changing demands. You know, the ICRC hack, the patch existed 2 months before the hack. It didn't seem that they had installed it, they hadn't patched up their systems. And sometimes, you know, they could have gotten away with it maybe 5 years ago, but nowadays you have to be up to date. You have to have the capacity in-house a lot of times for these systems to be well protected. And, you know, John and Adrian can speak on a technical aspect better than I can. I think we are seeing more conversation about cybersecurity. I think for a long time, that felt kind of different. You know, we did mention, you know, the notion of like, we have to think about cyberspace and what it means for humanitarian, but it was always focused on going back to data responsibility and ethical practices of using tools and products. I think now the reality is there's no escaping bringing cybersecurity into this dimension and into this conversation, and especially when it comes to, you know, peer-to-peer or near-peer conflicts. That is a reality that we can no longer ignore. We're living in it. And so I think humanitarians, peace builders, and even development sector is going to have these tough conversations and to really, one, buy into it, really invest in these capacities. And it's, you know, going back, I think I mentioned early on that donors push a lot of these tools and technologies on humanitarian sectors. Well, donors are also going to have to invest in maintenance. They're going to have to put in more funding and more resources into maintaining systems rather than just putting in money to set up a system and then, you know, have it operate on peanuts, on, you know, cents to the dollar. So I think that is also a dimension that needs to be brought into conversation.
That's a great point. Thanks, Ziad. And we can connect it to accountability as well. When we talked like who is accountable for these kind of attacks, I read many views of especially with the UN attack, not so much on ICRC, because ICRC had this, as you mentioned, transparency and openness approach. But with UN, should there be fees like for organizations not actually protecting the data, not raising their cybersecurity capabilities, but then as you said, what is the role of donors as well out there? So we have a hand raised, Benjamin. If you can involve Benjamin so he can ask a question directly. Benjamin, are you there? If you want to unmute yourself, and while you're figuring how to do that, I will put another, and then just a quick round of questions as well, because I just realized we have only 3 minutes left. The time is passing so quickly. I wanted to bring this trust issue again, and Eleanor, you mentioned this. I'm just thinking, and John as well brought this up, how we can make sure that we don't lose trust in all of these risks and attacks that are happening. Is the approach that ICRC took with this openness the right approach to do it? And then question for John and Adrian. I know that you are also part of the Paris call. Thanks for bringing this up. I put a link in the chat. Is this also part of the requirements from organizations? Do they have to be open, or is this something that you would recommend to organizations to be transparent when these kind of things are happening? Or is this maybe bringing additional layer of vulnerabilities for people who are already targeted? So first, Eleanor, around trust, and then I will bring it to John and Adrian, a little bit about Paris call.
Yes, thank you, Branka. What I was going to say is that we're all facing a kind of an epistemic revolution here about, what we trust, what kind of information, especially coming from open source repositories. There is at the same time a war of information and knowledge, and also, specific attacks to undermine trust and social cohesion. I would think that, one option would be to increasingly shift the cursor towards prevention and then mitigation, and that means using more foresight across sectors and across domains to better understand the threats and be able to, maybe adopt strategies that are less reactionary than what we do now. So, for example, the biomedicine and the genomics sector, the health sector, those are facing very similar challenges to the peacekeeping sector. They need to share information. You absolutely need to have information about patients. You need to share it and you need to preserve it. It's highly sensitive. And at the same time, you are working in a situation where you don't have the latest cybersecurity updates. The framework is difficult to implement. So maybe there are ways to talk across sectors to try to figure out, what are the strategies that work with specific contexts. A banking strategy will not work as well for peacekeeping, maybe as, what other actors in the health sector would be facing. So I think we need to open new conversation with experts and civil society and tech industry, and really try to do better foresight. Then, of course, data protection principles, I had mentioned it, the human skill set, absolutely, more funding, but also really targeting the type of skill set you have in an organization, and then legal considerations. I mean, right now, civilian data sets, sensitive civilian data sets are not necessarily protected by IHL, for example, because they are not necessarily considered as civilian objects. So we also need to push the conversation at a multilateral level to, think of those new threats to data integrity and not just confidentiality. I know we have very few time, so maybe I stop here, but
John, would you like to add something?
Sure, yeah, and I will be equally brief, as I know we're at time here, but I would love to take the opportunity to sort of emphasize, I think, the importance of the Paris call for trust and security in cyberspace as being an innovative and critical multi-stakeholder collaboration on improving cyber diplomacy and cybersecurity all up. I mentioned it in my initial remarks, but what the agreement does, which was launched in 2018, is it effectively takes the foundation of a lot of those UN principles or UN norms for responsible state behavior, and some norms from elsewhere as well, up-levels them a bit so that they're applicable not just to states, but to other broader sets of actors to uphold security across the digital domain, and then invites a multi-stakeholder community into a collaborative effort to uphold those. It is still early days for this kind of cooperation, even though it's been going on 4 years now. But already this community of states, of private sector, of civil society groups have put together, multiple, compendiums and guidance documents for, what does it mean to implement these respective principles? What does it mean for companies to uphold a commitment to, no hackbacks? What does it mean to effectively defend secure elections? And these are really wonderful outputs to see from this Paris Call community of supporters, because they're the product of successive workshops and dialogues across stakeholder groups that historically have not necessarily engaged on this level on these particular topics. So this is something that is open to everyone. It is managed by the French government. So I would encourage you to follow up on the website, both for the guidance materials that have been developed and to see if your organization would like to join that community.
Thank you, John. Adrian, you have the pleasure to wrap us up. Is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. It was a fantastic panel. Thanks everyone for your contributions. I think maybe I'll wrap this up in a call for more transparency. And if you think about it at the global level, what bad actors are doing in cyberspace is harming digital trust, right? It's creating digital distrust. And one of the ways to combat this beyond accountability is to create more digital trust. And one way to do that is to be a lot more transparent about what organizations are doing. And when they're facing tough situations like the CRC faced a month ago, to take leadership, face the adversity, and come clean, explain what happened, take leadership in the face of such crisis. And the response from ICRC in that respect has been exemplary. Now, I'll give you a couple of reasons why organizations should really take the lead when they have been attacked and explain what has happened, which is, I think, somewhat of a paradigm shift that we've seen operating in the last few years compared to previous years in which organizations, public, private, NGOs were trying to hide things under the carpet. And we've seen that it would come back later and bite them. And so the first thing is really that when you get attacked, it's not just you that get impacted, potentially your beneficiaries, your clients, partners, other organizations may be targeted. And so you have a moral responsibility to share information about what happened so others that may have been impacted know about it, or others that may be impacted later also get to prepare early on, right? The whole notion of ISACs, in particular, information sharing groups for organizations to share indicators of compromise and things like that, right? So it's the idea of collective resilience. There's also this idea of demonstrating leadership in the face of adversity, which is more important than actually the mistakes that you may have done, right? How you react in front of a crisis will be more important to your audience, your beneficiaries, or your clients, or your citizens than the mistakes that you've made, right? And then there's simply also the idea of controlling the narrative. If you're not speaking about what has happened, somebody else may speak about it, and that may reflect even more negatively on you. So try and take control of what is being said by being transparent about what happened. And we've got lots of great examples in terms of what to do, unfortunately, what not to do as well in the last few years. I think it's really this idea of sharing more and more that's going to help us build more digital trust, and in particular in the humanitarian sector, which comes, is something that's somewhat new, but that now with the CRC hack and the number of hacks that actually have happened in the last few years is becoming more and more important. So thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Adrian. You gave us actually a great concluding notes. It's really important to take the leadership when the crisis comes. Thanks, John, for guiding us through some very easy technical steps as well that we can already take. There are some more complicated ones, and we should think about them as well. Thanks, Ziad and Eleanor, for guiding us through some future recurrent and future risks that exist in cybersecurity space as well. for more complicated challenges that are out there, look at the work of Cyberpiece Institute and reach out to be really responsible and be open and transparent when the situation requests. So I know we just scratched the surface. It's a huge topic, but a huge thank you to our speakers for helping us to understand how big of a challenge this is. And hopefully this is just first of many discussions that we can have to understand and better tackle peace in the cybersecurity space. Thank you all.